The WWE World, Intercontinental, and Tag Team Championships are titles with well-documented history, honour and prestige. But not all titles were created equal in WWE. In fact, some WWE championships that were created with the best of intentions are now so obscure that only the hardest of hardcore fans will have ever even heard of them. My name's James, and this is ListMania Wrestling's most obscure WWE Championship titles in history. Now, we're going to be discounting any belts prior to the formation of the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. That's the old WWWF for those keeping track of the W's in 1963. So no Capital Wrestling Corporation exclusive belts like the NWA United States television title, for example. That title was abandoned a year prior to the name change. And yes, for those who don't know, the Capital Wrestling Corporation was part of the National Wrestling Alliance up until 1963. A bare-bones design looking like it was panel beaten using an old baking tray, but with an ever-familiar eagle on the front. The WWF International Heavyweight Championship got its start back in 1959 in the old NWA-affiliated Capital Wrestling Corporation. Or maybe the belt was created in 1948. That's right, nobody quite knows for sure when the original NWA International Heavyweight title was created, but what is known is that during the belt's initial existence, there was only one single champion, one of the greatest draws in wrestling history, old Twinkle Toes himself, Antonino Argentina Rocca. If the 1948 date is correct, then it's possible Rocca defeated the unfortunately named Dick Schickat for the title. And if it's 1959, it's possible Rocca defeated all-time legend Nature Boy Buddy Rogers for the belt. Or he was just handed a piece of leather with tin on it and was told he was the champion. Anyway, Rocca held onto the belt until October 3rd, 1963, when the recently renamed WWWF International Heavyweight Championship belt was just sort of forgotten about. Really, the belt was pretty much made up out of thin air to defend on international shows and held no real importance in the grand scheme of things. Then, in 1982, nearly 20 years later, the yet again renamed WWF International Heavyweight Championship was dusted off and handed to longtime Federation journeyman Tony Parisi. Probably literally handed to him in this case, as there's no record of Tony actually winning a match for that title. After a couple of months, Parisi dropped the championship to his former tag team partner Gino Brito. Brito then promptly lost the belt to Japanese legend Tatsumi Fujinami in Madison Square Garden on August 30th, 1982, and off to the races was the now all of a sudden more prestigious championship. Trading the title back and forth with the equally legendary Riki Choshu in some highly memorable bouts in Tokyo, the belt would become altogether less memorable when Akira Maeda took the championship from Fujinami by beating Pierre Mad Dog Lefevre in Madison Square Garden. I had to read that phonetically then as well. The WWF recognised Maeda as the new champion in a tournament final, but New Japan Pro Wrestling, where the WWF International Heavyweight Championship was predominantly being defended by at this point, and who the WWF had a close working relationship with, never acknowledged the title change and continued to recognise Fujinami as champion. The curious thing is that the belt that Akira was presented with in New York after winning this very WWF tournament was quite clearly a different belt, the UWF Heavyweight Championship to be specific. The shoot-style UWF was Akira Maeda's own promotion that was a couple of weeks away from debuting back in Japan. Maeda defended the supposed WWF belt as the UWF heavyweight title for a few shows before vacating it. After a brief return to the WWF in May of 1984, Vince McMahon Jr. figured that Akira and his UWF, or WWF, whatever, international title weren't coming back. So Vince McMahon Jr. just started recognising Fujinami as champion again in July. I mean, Fujinami had the original WWF international belt anyway, so you might as well have just done away with it at this point because nobody outside of Japan cared anyway. Like the brief run of the UWF heavyweight title, the actual WWF international heavyweight title had just as ignominious an end, quite frankly. After holding the belt for over 1,000 days, Fujinami wrestled Super Strong Machine to a double disqualification and vacated the belt. A few months later, the WWF International Heavyweight title was deactivated and never brought up again thanks to the WWF and New Japan terminating their working relationship on October 31st, 1985. Now, remember that date, as you'll be hearing about that date several times throughout this video. The WWWF United States Heavyweight Championship has an even more convoluted origin story than that of the International Heavyweight title, but bear with us here. The belt gets its start on April 20th, 1960, when Nature Boy Buddy Rogers is recognised as the Northeast version of the NWA United States Heavyweight Champion. Buddy Rogers then vacated the US title on June 30th, 1961, after he defeated Pat O'Connor for the most coveted title in all of wrestling at that time, the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. Fast forward a couple of years, and with Vince McMahon Sr.'s Capital Wrestling Corporation splitting from the dominant governing body, the NWA, Buddy Rogers was crowned the WWWF champion. Yet he still wore the belt design of his old United States Championship, because I guess they hadn't really had time to come up with a proper world title belt design at the time. The US belt nameplate was changed to read World's Champion, despite the Continental United States motif, and Buddy was officially recognised as the WWWF World Champion on April 11th, 1963. However, just 5 days prior to this recognition, Bobo Brazil was crowned the WWWF United States Heavyweight Champion. It's believed this was because Bobo had actually defeated Buddy Rogers for the NWA World title some time earlier, only to refuse the belt when Rogers claimed to have suffered a groin injury during the bout, a devious ploy by the dastardly heel Nature Boy. The WWWF United States Heavyweight Championship was essentially the Bobo Brazil belt. Bobo would capture the championship a record 7 times, including trading the belt with his greatest foe, the original Sheik, in the late 1960s. After incumbent champion Pedro Morales had to vacate the United States Heavyweight Championship due to winning the WWWF World Heavyweight Championship, Bobo was awarded the US title, where he held onto it for 5 years. Some say that Bobo barely defended the title during this final run, but be that as it may, the title was finally deactivated on March 1st, 1976. One of the more beautiful examples of a wrestling title, where many examples from the 1960s were little more than a glorified belt buckle, the WWWF Junior Heavyweight Championship got its start in 1965 to give the quote-unquote smaller wrestlers, and by smaller we mean guys in the 220 to 230 pound range, a belt to fight over. Only the hardest of hardcore wrestling fans would have ever heard of the name of the inaugural champion, Paul de Gales. The only other champions, Johnny DeFazio and Jackie Nicholas, are just as obscure. What else is obscure are the dates and towns the title was won and lost in, as this information seems entirely lost to the ages, a fine example of how seriously unimportant the junior heavyweight title was in the grand scheme of things. There's even a rumour that a wrestler called Bradley Lowe won and lost the title to DeFazio, but once again nobody knows for sure because nobody bothered documenting it. The championship was retired in 1972 along with champion Johnny DeFazio's retirement, before being reactivated in 1978 as a joint venture of sorts with New Japan Pro Wrestling. Carlos Jose Estrada defeated Tony "Hey Smartass" Gurria for the belt on January 20th, before a host of Japanese wrestlers had a monopoly on the junior heavyweight title. This is because the WWF junior heavyweight title was confusingly only defended a handful of times in the WWF, and the rest of the time the championship was contested in New Japan. A memorable title change did actually occur in the WWF in no less than Madison Square Garden, where his WWF debut several years before Vince McMahon signed the British Bulldogs tag team, the Dynamite Kid failed to wrest the title from then champion Tiger Mask in 1982.
Tiger Mask is quite the thing over in Japan.
After a few more years of the WWF Junior Heavyweight Championship being a prominent part of New Japan's title picture, the championship was deactivated, just like the International Heavyweight Championship, when the WWF and New Japan severed their working relationship on October 31st, 1985. New Japan would briefly recognise the NWA World Junior Heavyweight Championship as canon following the split, before crowning their own Junior Heavyweight Champion Shiro Koshinaka on February 6th, 1986. One of the first mega obscure titles I actually heard about when I was a lad. It almost seemed mythical at the time because there was so little information on it. Turns out there was a reason for there being so little information on it, and that's because the title, despite being active quote-unquote for over a decade, was defended a grand total of 5 times that we know of. Even though the belt was created in 1978, let's head back a couple of years earlier to 1976. Vince McMahon Sr. was still very much in charge of the then WWWF, and Antonio Inoki was the owner as well as the top star for New Japan Pro Wrestling. Throughout the 1970s, Inoki had been putting on supposedly real professional wrestling matches with various other martial artists, with Inoki winning nearly all of them. The proto-mixed martial arts encounter with Muhammad Ali, which was initially meant to be worked but agreed to be a shoot fight with a bizarre set of rules, is by far the most well known. The Ali Inoki bout took place in June 1976, but in February of that same year, Inoki created the NJPW Real World Martial Arts Championship, and then gave it to himself to hold after defeating Dutch judoka Willem Ruska on February 6th. Over almost 3 years, Inoki would frequently wrestle legitimate amateur wrestling, boxing and judo stars, defending the belt in worked matches which were often billed or at least suggested to be real, before taking a booking with the WWWF on December 18th, 1978. The story goes that Vincent James McMahon was so enamored with Inoki's exploits that he bestowed upon him the WWWF Martial Arts title after Inoki defeated a wrestler called Texas Red. The thing is, Inoki was already the real world martial arts champion. It seems that what had actually happened was that Inoki, with McMahon's blessing, simply renamed his own belt to include the WWWF initials. Why? Well, at the time, Japanese promotions were desperate to be associated with established American promotions to give their territories an air of legitimacy. New Japan rival All Japan Pro Wrestling's owner and top star Giant Baba made sure to join the American National Wrestling Alliance shortly after All Japan's formation in 1972. Baba even allegedly paid a decent sum to hold the coveted NWA World Heavyweight Championship in 1974 for a brief period for the photo opportunities and bragging rights. When Inoki formed New Japan Pro Wrestling also in 1972, Inoki essentially purchased the rights to the NWF World Championship, so he could tie New Japan to a pre-existing American wrestling title. NWF, I hear you say? What the heck is that? Well, the NWF was a reasonably small territory based out of Buffalo, New York, that had only been established in 1970. It seems that Inoki was simply desperate to link his company with any pre-existing promotion, and that's the only title that was available. So with Inoki being handed the WWWF Martial Arts Championship, the Real World Martial Arts Championship was absorbed into it. Or made defunct. Well, either way, Inoki was now the WWWF Martial Arts Champion. Then he proceeded to do almost nothing with it. After winning the belt in December 1978, we could find a grand total of 5 defences of said title. 1 in 1979, 2 in 1980, and 2 in 1989. The WWF stopped officially recognising that belt, as if they could even remember it existed, on October 31st, 1985, when the WWF, and say it with me, and New Japan officially parted ways, yet the belt remained a WWF labelled property. After holding the belt for over 3,000 days, easy to do when you never defend it I suppose, Inoki lost to Georgian judoka Shota Chochishvili on April 24th, 1989. Inoki would regain the title a month later in a rematch before Inoki simply handed the belt to Shota during a New Japan Martial Arts Festival event in Moscow on December 31st, 1989, as a mark of respect to the only man to beat him for that title, as well as a symbol of peace between the Soviets and Japan. New Japan recognised Inoki as the final champion. While the title was abandoned in Mother Russia, this is not where the story of the physical belt itself ends. In September 1990, the Greatest 18 Club Championship was established, and the new title, along with the former WWF World Martial Arts belt, was awarded to Riki Choshu on February 25th, 1991. After a grand total of 3 title defences over 538 days, the Great Muta won the Greatest 18 Club title, as well as the top honour in New Japan, the IWGP Heavyweight Championship. Muta immediately retired the Great 18 title, saying he wanted to focus on his IWGP title defences, and that was that. So after 14 years and less than 10 defences of the physical belt, the WWF Martial Arts title was finally done for good. Well, every wrestling fan has heard of the WWE's second most coveted championship. Well, at least at one point it was the second most coveted championship, the Intercontinental Heavyweight Championship. Few remember the title's immediate predecessor, the WWF North American Heavyweight Championship. The reason for this is because the title was only around for about 3 years and was only defended in the United States for 6 months. The future $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase originally signed with the WWWF in the February of 1979. As part of the deal, Vince McMahon Sr. created a brand new title and handed it to DiBiase rather than, have Ted win it in a match. At least Ted, a 5-year veteran at this point despite his fresh-faced appearance, defended the belt regularly on McMahon's television shows. Well, more like incessantly, because Ted DiBiase defended that title on television nearly every other week for 4 months, most likely because DiBiase was a great talent and he was hotly tipped to become the future world champion down the line. Pat Patterson would win the hastily renamed WWF North American title from DiBiase, courtesy of some brass knucks stashed in his tights, on June 19, 1979, and defended the belt for a couple of months before the championship disappeared from North America altogether. As explained on WWF television, Pat Patterson had flown over to Rio de Janeiro to take part in a one-day tournament for the brand new WWF Intercontinental title. Now, this IC title tournament was completely fictitious, and during the course of one promo, Pat and his manager, the Grand Wizard, couldn't even agree how many people competed that day. Pat also declared he didn't care what happened to the WWF North American title because he was on to bigger and better things. A couple of months after Patterson had apparently vacated the belt, he would head over to Japan to give the WWF North American title a fitting send-off, considering that's where, so many WWE titles over the years go to die. Patterson dropped the belt to Seiji Sakaguchi on November 8, 1979. Sakaguchi then proceeded to defend the title half a dozen times over the course of a year and a half, before the WWF abandoned the title entirely on April 23, 1981. Canadian strongman Dino Bravo, as hard as it might be to believe for non-Montreal-based wrestling fans, was Montreal's version of Hulk Hogan, having been one of Canada's biggest draws and most popular heavyweight champions for years. The year before the Canadian Championship was created, the WWF had already bought up Stu Hart's Calgary-based Stampede promotion, as well as taking over Frank Tunney's Maple Leaf Wrestling in Toronto. With George Cannon's Windsor, Ontario-based Superstars of Wrestling promotion already pushed into extinction thanks to the WWF slyly taking over its television slot, all that was left to swallow up to achieve total Canadian coverage was Lutte International, based in Quebec. Dino Bravo was Lutte International's top babyface star and heavyweight champion by the time the WWF attempted to outpromote the entrenched Montreal territory. When the WWF failed to get a foothold, Lutte International's co-owners Bravo and Gino Brito decided that instead of going through a costly promotional war they could ill afford to fight, they would work with the WWF instead to co-promote a bunch of shows locally. As part of the deal, Dino Bravo, who was the incumbent Lutte International's heavyweight champion, would wrestle for the WWF while being billed as the WWF Canadian champion.
The Canadian Heavyweight Wrestling Champion, Dino Bravo!
Dino never seemed to actually wear the WWF Canadian title to the ring for whatever reason, but he would be billed as such and even defend the title in McMahon's burgeoning international powerhouse promotion from around August 18, 1985 until around January 22, 1986, when Bravo left the WWF to return to Lutte International. Bravo's leaving the WWF was actually a bigger deal than what most realised at the time. After the WWF and Lutte International co-promoted over half a dozen shows at the Montreal Forum, Dino Bravo was finally supposed to wrestle WWF World Heavyweight Champion Hulk Hogan in a title-for-title clash on January 13, 1986. But that bout never happened. It's believed that Vince McMahon Jr., who had bought the WWF from his ailing father several years earlier, decided that with Hulk Hogan at his peak popularity, he couldn't afford to allow the Hulkster to lose to Bravo, even if it was by countout or disqualification. Bravo ended up wrestling and defeating Big John Studd instead that night, before Dino quit the WWF entirely out of protest. The WWF Canadian Heavyweight Championship, as recognised by the World Wrestling Federation, was deactivated a little over a week after the Canadian strongman quit. However, Bravo would remain Canadian International Heavyweight Champion as recognised by Lutte International until he lost the belt to Samu on June 30th. As a sorry side note, like he had done to George Cannon a couple of years earlier, Vince McMahon had basically figured out that after partnering up and essentially getting Lutte International's seal of approval in the Montreal market after co-promoting several shows together, Vince McMahon signed an exclusive agreement to run the WWF shows in Lutte International's home venue, the Montreal Forum. Lutte International went bankrupt less than 18 months later, with Bravo returning to the WWF no longer the Canadian heavyweight champion as a result. The various tag titles on this list don't have a particularly long history, and our first tag title subject, the WWF United States Tag Team Championships, are no different. When the Capital Wrestling Corporation was still in existence, the Northeast version of the NWA World Tag Team Championships were supposedly the main tag team titles contested in McMahon Sr.'s territory from around 1957, which was also co-promoted by Tootsmont's Manhattan Wrestling Enterprises. Manhattan Wrestling Enterprises ceased operations in August of that same year, and with that, the incumbent tag team champions, Antonino Rocca and Miguel Perez, just seemed to remain the champions, I guess, for over 4 years before the titles were deactivated. In 1958, the Northeast version of the NWA United States Tag Team Championships was created, probably because the aforementioned NWA Tag Team titles had been forgotten about, with Don Curtis and Mark Lewin becoming the inaugural title holders after winning a tournament on July 1st, 1958. A who's who of wrestling legends would win the United States Tag Team titles, with Eddie and Jerry Graham becoming the most frequent holders of those belts, up until 1967 when the titles were deactivated. Why? Nobody really knows. The reason for the deactivation of the US tag titles has been lost to time, but what's even more curious is that the WWWF, as it was known in 1967, then went nearly 2 whole years without any tag titles whatsoever. Well, that was until June 1st, 1969, when the Rising Suns Mitsu Arakawa and Toru Tanaka won a tournament in Japan for the WWWF International Tag Team Championships. Except they didn't. Like so many WWF titles before and after, the tournament was made up and never actually happened. The WWWF simply gave them the belts and then made up a backstory. The International Tag Team title belts were featured fairly prominently, not only in the WWWF, but also for Bruno Sammartino's Pittsburgh-based Spectator Sports that he ran and also wrestled for, while simultaneously holding the WWWF World Championship and performing as McMahon's top draw. By 1971, the belt started to be phased out entirely from the WWWF. Vince McMahon Sr. produced the World Tag Team titles in June of that year, which would remain the top tag team prize in the promotion for nearly 40 years. The first World Tag Team champions, Luke Graham and Tarzan Taylor, would go on to win the international version of those tag titles later that year, but instead of absorbing the lesser tag titles into the World Tag titles, they instead lost them a month later to the final champions, Gito Mongol and Johnny DeFazio. By the middle of 1972, Bruno Sammartino's Pittsburgh promotion was sold to the National Wrestling Federation, and the international tag team titles were abandoned for over a dozen years. Unsurprisingly, New Japan, who loves an enigmatic American belt, decided to revive the slightly renamed WWF International Tag Team titles on May 24, 1985, when Kengo Kimura and Tatsumi Fujinami defeated Adrian Adonis and Dick Murdoch in a tournament final. The newly crowned international tag champs defended their new titles a handful of times over the course of 5 months, before the big split between the WWF and New Japan, say it with me, on October 31st, 1985, saw the champions stripped and the titles were once again abandoned, this time permanently. Japan once again proves to be the country where WWF titles go to perish, but Japan is also where random WWF titles are born, before being killed off, of course. Of this entire list, no title is more obscure than the WWF Intercontinental Tag Team Championships, so much so that it took many years for a single photo of what may have been the belts to surface online. Years after the New Japan deal soured, the WWF decided to venture back to the land of the rising sun and partnered up with various promotions. One of these promotions was Lucha Libre-inspired UWF Japan. Now, this isn't to be confused with Akira Maeda's UWF, or the revived newborn UWF, or UWFI, or Bill Watts' Universal Wrestling Federation, or Herb Abrams' UWF, or any other UWFs that have existed over the decades, which opened up in 1990. To solidify the working relationship, the WWF created the Intercontinental Tag Team Championships and gave them to the existing Mexican UWA Tag Team Champions Gran Hamada and Perro Aguayo on January 7th, 1991. Then, as best as anybody in the English-speaking world can figure out, the titles may or may not have been defended in Japan for a few months before the World Wrestling Federation withdrew support at some point in July of that same year. With that withdrawal, the Intercontinental Tag Team titles were also finished up, with nobody knowing the fate of those belts. A few months later, the Mexican UWA created their own version of the Intercontinental Tag Team titles to be defended in UWF Japan, with the inaugural champions being Bulldog KT and Coolio SZ, or SZ I guess, better known today as Jado and Guido. The UWA version of the Intercontinental Tag Titles, however, are surprisingly still competed for to this day in the Japanese lower league promotion Fight of the Ring. Now, as a little bonus, we're now going to talk about a couple of titles that you are probably maybe more likely to have been aware of, but maybe not their full lineage. Now, every modern wrestling fan knows that WWE currently promotes women's WWE Tag Team titles, but did you know that the original version of those belts stretched back decades more than you might think? For those of you who are rock and wrestling era fans, you might well remember Japanese wrestling sensations the Jumping Bomb Angels wrestling the Glamour Girls in matches that were light years ahead of what most of the guys in the WWF were doing at that time as far as quick, hard-hitting, high-flying matches. That being said, the WWF Women's Tag Team titles actually stretches back to 1983. Conflicting data exists. WWE claims that Princess Victoria and Velvet McIntyre were the NWA Women's Tag Team Champions on May 13, 1983, when the WWF once again seceded from the National Wrestling Alliance. The NWA records show that Penny Mitchell and Velvet McIntyre then won the titles from Joyce Grable and Wendy Richter that same day in Calgary, dramatic pause, Alberta, Canada, with Prince Victoria nowhere to be seen. Be that as it may, the WWF recognised Princess Victoria and Velvet McIntyre as the inaugural WWF Women's Tag Team Champions that same day. Nearly a year later, on April 4th, 1984, the WWF actually purchased the NWA Women's Tag Title belts from the National Wrestling Alliance, despite a bitter promotional war breaking out between the two entities at that time. Now, the only real interesting fact about these particular titles is that they remain the only WWE belts in the 70-plus year history of the promotion that have changed hands in Africa, Cairo, Egypt to be precise. On August 1st, 1985, the Glamour Girls, Judy Martin and Leilani Kai, defeated Desiree Peterson and Velvet McIntyre on a hot Egyptian night for the tag titles in front of thousands of fans and sarcophaguses and the Sphinx itself. Possibly. The WWF Women's Tag Team titles were scrapped in 1989, but the writing was already on the wall by the beginning of 1988. After a stellar outing at the first ever WWF Royal Rumble event that January, the Glamour Girls and the Jumping Bomb Angels only made a couple more appearances in the World Wrestling Federation. Three of the women would leave the WWF soon after, with only Judy Martin remaining with the company to battle WWF World Women's Champion Rockin' Robin up until June of that year. Both tag teams were linked back up in June of 1988 for All Japan Women, where the Glamour Girls regained the tag titles one last time. The Jumping Bomb Angels retired in 1989, and Leilani Kai left wrestling until returning in 1991, and Judy Martin pretty much just did the same, leaving the titles in limbo before being ignored completely. Despite the titles not being seen in the WWF since March 1988, it took Vince McMahon and co nearly a full year to declare the titles abandoned. At least the WWF Women's Tag Title belts made it to the spiritual final resting place of all obscure WWF titles before being deactivated completely, Japan. And despite the WWE bringing back women's tag titles in 2019, the current belts share no lineage with the 1980s women's tag titles, despite being the same company and having the exact same name, aside from the old WWF moniker. Now, once again, you'll probably be saying to yourself, I absolutely remember the WWF Light Heavyweight title. It was won by Taka Michinoku in 1997 and was featured throughout the WWF Attitude Era before being unified with the WCW Cruiserweight title some months after Vince McMahon purchased World Championship Wrestling in 2001. You might even remember that Gillberg had it for ages. Well, smart guy, if you said that, then you are sadly mistaken on two fronts. Allow us to explain. The WWF Light Heavyweight title was actually conceived all the way back in 1981 and awarded to Perro Aguayo after he defeated his future WWF Intercontinental Tag Team title partner, Gran Hamada. How wonderful when things tie up like this. Despite the title debuting in Japan, the championship itself was created for the Mexican market, specifically for the Mexican UWA promotion that would in the future partner up with the UWF Japan promotion. Unlike many of the belts on this list, the WWF Light Heavyweight title would actually be taken seriously and was a hotly contested championship throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, with both Perro Aguayo and Villano III winning the belt 7 times apiece. By 1985, however, the UWA was on the brink of collapse thanks to the fall of the value of the Mexican peso, forcing numerous UWA stars to find employment elsewhere. Reigning WWF Light Heavyweight Champion Villano III was stripped of the belt after he signed with Tijuana-based Promo Azteca in March of 1995, and by December of that same year, the UWF itself had folded. New WWF Light Heavyweight Champion Aero Flash had won the belt back in June, and remained champion after UWA's closure. Flash would leave Mexico entirely and head over to Japan to defend the belt in the Michinoku Pro Wrestling promotion, which is where he would lose the title to the Great Sasuke on March 24, 1996. The belt would bounce around Michinoku Pro and New Japan over the next couple of years, but it was the near mythical Super J Cup tournament that would make the WWF Light Heavyweight title the subject of a further tension between the WWF and their hated rivals at the time, World Championship Wrestling. In early August 1996, New Japan promoted the Super J Cup tournament over several days for the J Crown, a unification of no less than 8 separate lighter weight category championship belts from the US, UK, Mexico, and of course, Japan. The Great Sasuke won the tournament and the 8 belts, which included the WWF Light Heavyweight title. On October 11th, Sasuke lost all 8 titles to Ultimo Dragon. As Ultimo Dragon was signed to WCW at the time, he brought all 8 belts as well as his already held NWA World Middleweight title onto WCW television several times in November and December of 1996. Dragon would then win the WCW Cruiserweight Championship from Dean Malenko at the WCW Starrcade 1996 pay-per-view, meaning that for 6 days, Ultimo Dragon was in possession of 10 separate belts, including the WWF and WCW titles simultaneously. What with Medusa jumping to WCW and literally dropping the WWF Women's title in the bin a year earlier and the subsequent lawsuits that followed, both companies were hyper aware of their company's logo or intellectual property appearing on their rivals' television shows. Yet somehow, because the WWF Light Heavyweight title had been an afterthought for so long and had never actually been contested for in the WWF, it flew under everybody's radar for weeks on end. Ultimo Dragon lost the J Crown, excluding the WCW Cruiserweight title and the NWA Middleweight title, to Jushin Thunder Liger at New Japan's Wrestling World 1997 event on January 4th, 1997, which included the WWF title. The belt, along with numerous others, would be contested as part of the J Crown in New Japan throughout 1997 until November 5th. That's when the WWF, who had been half-heartedly promoting lighter weight wrestlers for months in a bid to compete with WCW's Supreme Cruiserweight division, decided to create a WWF Light Heavyweight title. That was until somebody actually clued the WWF office in that exact belt already existed. Then the incumbent J-Crown champion Shinjiro Otani was forced to send back that belt to its rightful owner. Otani also dissolved the J-Crown entirely, sending all the other belts back to their respective promotions, aside from the IWGP Junior Heavyweight Championship, which belonged to New Japan, who he wrestled for anyway. As an aside, the WWF decided to completely rejig the belt from a not too dissimilar reworking of the 1970s era WWF title to a dreary pentagon-shaped, wristwatch-sized obscenity that looked about as prestigious as Perry Saturn's mop. As for the WWF Light Heavyweight title being amalgamated with the WCW Cruiserweight title toward the end of 2001, that didn't actually happen either. The original plan was for all WWF and WCW titles to be unified at the conclusion of that god-awful WCW invasion of the WWF storyline at the Survivor Series 2001 pay-per-view that November. Unfortunately for incumbent WWF Light Heavyweight Champion Sean X-Pac Waltman, he got injured the month before and had to sit out the big finale. The WWF Light Heavyweight title was never seen on television again. However, X-Pac actually defended the belt on WWF house shows up until March of 2002. The WWF Light Heavyweight title was never unified with the WCW Cruiserweight Championship as was the original plan. Instead, the title was merely abandoned without so much of a whimper when the renamed WWF Cruiserweight title became the de facto #1 lighterweight championship in that promotion. Everybody, thank you so much for watching this video of ListMania Wrestling's most obscure titles of all time. Please, if you would like to help this channel grow, subscribe, like, leave a comment, and we will catch you in the next video.